Welcome to Gus Does This. Today, we're making beer. Well, we're going to start making beer. So, as with most things in life, preparation is where it all happens. If you don't prepare and set it up right and do things in order, you end up with a mess. Beer making is no different. This is a very simple, basic recipe that any beginner can do, so don't feel intimidated. There's not a lot of equipment you need. First thing you're going to need, though, is a food-grade bucket that holds at least 6 gallons. You're going to end up with 5 gallons in here of liquid, but it's going to ferment and bubble, and you don't want it to clog anything up and have issues. So you want a little extra room there. Plus, if you ever make wine, you'll need 6 gallons, not just 5. So I've got a larger bucket. You're also going to need a lid for that bucket and a hole precisely sized to go with your bubbler, your valve. It's a one-way valve that basically allows the CO2 to escape and nothing to go in. So as the beer is fermenting, bubbling off all that gas, it's got somewhere to go and not explode. You don't want an explosion in your house. That's the other reason you don't want a small bucket. If you get clogs up, you may blow things up and end up with beer everywhere. Spouses do not like that. I can tell you that from experience. The other thing you're going to need is some cleaning items for sanitizing everything. That is the number one prep thing you need to do, is you need to sanitize everything. So I'll end up throwing all of this in the bathtub with some warm water and basically the instructions of whatever cleaner I end up picking here and going with that. Some of them don't need to be rinsed depending on the cleaner. Some of them do. Just follow your instructions on whatever cleaner you get. Sometimes you'll need a big spoon later when you're stirring the pot. You're definitely going to need a big pot. I think mine is probably a 3-gallon pot. I'm making 5 gallons of beer, so I'll probably be cooking about 2.5 gallons because I don't want it to boil over. So while you're making beer, after you start those first few ingredients, it's called Wart, W-O-R-T. To cool it down after you've cooked it and done everything you need to do to it for that hour that it takes, in this method that I'm doing, you need to cool it down. And this, you hook up to your hose outside, run it into the house, and you set this down inside your wort, run cold water through it, and it cools it down very quickly. We'll see that later when we use it. This we won't use for a little while, because after we first make the beer, we're going to pour it into here, and we'll let it sit in here and ferment for probably a week, at which point it'll basically stop fermenting, and basically it'll have turned all of that sugar and all those grains into alcohol, and the yeast won't have anything else to eat, won't have anything else to do, and it'll just die, and it'll all fall down to the bottom, at which point we know we're done. And at that point, I will use this device here, which is just a siphon, and we will siphon it out of here and into this. This is called a carboy. This one's glass. They make plastic ones. You don't really even need one of these. You could have a second bucket, and you could siphon from one bucket into another bucket. And basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to get all that beer that you just made off of all that dead yeast that's going to collect down here at the bottom. Because the longer it sits in that dead yeast, more odd flavors you may pick up and get in your beer. So you want to, and the other fancy thing on this siphon is that it's got this end down here to where it's not picking up from the bottom, it's picking up a little higher up. So all that, you're not sucking all that sediment into the next container that you're putting it in. So, and we'll see that later as well. Anyway, it's going to be a fun time. Right now, I've got some of my ingredients. This is my malt, and then I've got hops, and I have yeast in the fridge for right now. I may make a starter. I've never done that before, just because I have a dry yeast, not a liquid yeast. And if you want to really get things moving and go faster and wake that yeast up, you can add a little something to it and warm it up and get it going before you put it in your beer, or your malt to make beer. I don't think I'm probably going to do that. I'll probably just take it out of the fridge in a little while, let it warm up, and then we'll just sprinkle it on our wort when we're ready. Because if it takes an extra day, my house is sitting at between 70 and 74 degrees during the day. For this recipe, that's fine, and that means it's probably going to do it. It's probably going to make the beer pretty quickly. That yeast is going to go to work, it being slightly warm in here. An extra day of that yeast waking up, it's not going to hurt anything, because it's going to happen pretty quickly anyway because of the temperatures in my house. This is called a Whirlfloc. And basically you put that in the beer about 15 minutes before the end of the boil, and it clears things up. It helps bind up with any little particles it may have found in the beer and helps clock them all together so they can drop out with the yeast later. What else? I think that's about it. I really need to go throw all this in the bathtub and give it all a good wash and a good sanitize. I'm probably going to lay out some paper towels here so I can put all this back on here so it won't get dirty again when I set it down on the counter if the counter's dirty. And then I may put some paper towels on top of some things just to keep dust from landing on it and messing it up. Anyway, that's where we're at, and we're going to go from here. Alright, here we are at the very beginning. We are going to light this bad boy up. We've got 2 gallons of good, clean, filtered water in there. You can use tap water, but if you got good drinking water in your house, then yeah, you can use that. But if you don't like the taste of your water, you don't want to use that water in your beer. So I have a filter in my fridge, and then just use that water. So it takes the chlorine out and some of the other bits or whatever. But good stuff. So it's really important that you stir this and get it moving while you're pouring it all in and getting it going. You really don't want to burn this. This malt is, there's a lot of sugar in it, so it will burn and stick real easy to the bottom, and that would not be a good start to a good beer. So. Alright, we have all our malt in there. Let me give you a little look. There is your color. Now, this is liquid malt. They make a dry malt, and both of those are the quick and easy way to make beer. If you want to do it the long, drawn-out process, it's called all grain, and there's a lot more equipment and quite a few more steps involved, because you're taking the actual grain and all the process that somebody else took to get this malt in this condition before you put it in here. You have to do all those steps in all grain. So anyway, this is a good process. Anyway, we're going to let this come up to a boil, back up to a boil. Once it does, we are going to add some hops. And this hops here is going to be our bittering hops. This is not going to be a very bitter beer at all, so that's why this number is so low. But this is a very renowned German hops that is used in German style beers. So I like it, and I've used it many times before. Anyway, that's going to be our bittering hops. We're going to put a whole ounce in there. We're going to boil it for 60 whole minutes. So you see how much room I've got? That didn't work. You see how much space I have from the top of the liquid, the wort basically, to the top of my kettle? You want as much space there as you can get, so that when this stuff starts boiling, there's a certain point where, you know, it'll have a nice little rumble of a boil, and then there's a breaking point where it just goes bonkers and climbs right up and tries to get out of the pot. So you have to watch it very, very closely, because the last thing you want to do is, you know, have all your precious wort all over the stovetop and not in here. So they also make this pot specifically made for making beer. It has on its lid, first off, it's glass, so you can see if it's boiling or not, what it's doing. Second off, it's got this little valve, so a lot of the excess steam can just come pouring out of that instead of all of it coming around the edge. Some of it's going to come around the edge, but quite a bit of it will come out of there and help keep the boil from overboiling. So there you go. We learned something else today. We are getting close. Now it's almost time to start our timer. We need to cook this for 60 minutes. It helps sanitize it all. It also helps the hops to make your beer bitter. And it gives us time to put a few other things in there. Clarifying agent, the Whirlfloc Tablet. More hops at the end. Hops at the end add aroma and flavor, whereas the hops at the beginning just add bitterness. Alright, I think that's a pretty good boil. I'm going to put the hops in. And they kind of, these are pellet hops, so they kind of explode when they hit. As you can see, it just turned green, at least the top did, because they were compressed. They basically chopped up and cut up all the hops, which is just a flower off of a plant, a vining plant. And they chop up all that greenage, and then they compress them down into these little pellets. So as soon as that pellet hits the hot water, it just explodes back to what it originally was, as a million little pieces of little green leaf. And when you first turn it on, it really, first pour them in, they really take off, and now it's settled down. Alright, so yeah, that's a point when you want to watch for boil over. Cleaning up my sides, getting some of that hops off the edges. Alright, now we're gonna start our timer. We are going to want to cook this for 60 minutes. Go. I'm also going to cover it. And I'm going to turn it down because it looks like it's getting a little crazy. Plus, when you cover it, it boils even more. So, not a whole lot to see here. See if that lid clears up in a second. You can already see the steam coming out of the steam hole. And the steam's already condensing on the top, making it easier to see through. So as you can see, my stove is not level. All my hops have floated to the left, and most of my boil's going on the right. So that'll shift around a little bit here and there as it goes. And here you can see some steam boiling off the back here. So I think I'm going to turn it down just a hair, because it's really starting to roar now. As you can hear and see. So every 5 minutes or so you need to just get in there and kind of stir things up so you don't have all these hops and all this stuff collect around the edges and not be part of the beer. So, yeah, definitely don't want to go for a walk right now or do something like that. You really need to keep an eye on this. And I continue to keep turning it down because it's not not chilling out at all. I'm all the way down to medium now. Okay, we've been boiling for 45 minutes. And every 5 minutes we've been scraping the sides, getting the hops off the edges so they continue to boil. And it's looking good. The water level's gone down as we've evaporated some water through the boiling process. It's also gotten a little darker as it's cooked. So anyway, the timer is about to go off for my 45 minutes. I'll shut that off. So now, after 45 minutes, we're going to add a Whirlfloc, which is if you ever seen a recipe, something calling for Irish moss, that's similar stuff. And this is also my last batch of hops. This is what's going to give us our flavor and some of our aroma. Just mix that in. Set this down for a second. I'll show you something. The Whirlfloc it sits there and fuzzes for a while. It takes a while to melt and break down in there. But again, just like before, the hops hit and immediately fall apart into a million little pieces. So get this one back up to a boil. And we'll go for 15 more minutes. And then we'll be ready to cool it off. Alright, while we're waiting for the last few minutes of the wort to boil, this is my wort chiller. It's basically a bunch of brass tubing all twisted up. We sanitized this last night, and it's sitting on a sanitized piece of paper towel, and it's run down here and hooked up to a hose which goes outside right around the corner outside the back door. So what we're going to do is, when this stops boiling in 8 minutes, we're going to move the pot over here to the sink, take the lid off. We're going to submerge this down in it. We're then going to go turn the cold water on at the faucet, and all that water is going to travel into the wort and then out this. So thereby transferring all the heat. This will suck in the heat from the pot as the cold water travels through and basically dump all the heat out here. So in 10 or 15 minutes you can cool this thing down rather than having to go buy bags and bags of ice like I've done in the past and kind of float this thing around in a bath of ice water. So the quicker you cool this thing off, the better. The enemy of beer and all alcohol is bacteria. So the quicker you can do all these steps, the less bacteria you end up with in your beer. That way all you have is the good stuff, the good yeast, instead of bad yeast making bad bacteria making foul flavors. You want the good yeast, one that's been used for centuries and determined to be really good for beer. You don't want the bad ones. So you just always want to minimize the amount of time between all these different steps just to keep, and you want to sanitize everything. If you ever have a doubt, sanitize it again. So there you go. We'll get this operating here in just a few minutes. We have beer. Sort of. We need to let all that stuff filter out of it, drop to the bottom, and it takes a while. Plus, we need to add the yeast. Alright, so let's do this. I'm going to point you. How's that? Right there at the sink. I'm going to grab this thing very carefully. Set it down there, make sure nothing goes in it. Alright. So this stuff is all sanitized, and we are going to carefully set it down there in our wort. Get you a close up here. So you can see where I just set that down in there. And now I am going to stick my outlet over here somewhere where it can't go flying anywhere, because when I turn the water on outside, I don't know what happens inside, right? Alright, so here I've got my setup going. Lots of condensation going on. Lots of steam coming off there. Lots of cooling action going on. Anyway, I got my exit hose going down into my sink, into my aerator. Anyway, I'm going to go get the thermometer out, take a temperature reading, and get an idea where we want to get down to. We're already down to like 130, just in 5 minutes, a couple minutes. It's quite the amazing dimension here. Alright. While we wait for that to cool off, we're going to grab our bucket. And here is our lid. There's our airlock. We can go ahead and put that together. So, this is the outside. I wish there was a better way to do things with the camera in your hand. Alright. That's the top. I'm going to Shove that in there. Now we just need to put a little bit of water. So I only needed enough to go halfway up that little collar. And I'm going to pop that lid on. And this is what's going to go in the bung hole. Yes, it's called a bung hole. And this needs to go down in there. Alright. So we have our airlock. So as we generate gas, it's going to come up, it's going to push up that domed thing until it gets high enough to, and enough force to bubble out air up underneath, and it's going to come out a couple little holes up here. And nothing can go back in because it can't go down through that water. The bubbles are just coming up through the water. Anyway, that's prepped and ready to go. Our lid's clean, sitting there. Oh, I forgot to mention last night, one of the other things you need, I guess you don't have to. I've made beer a lot where I don't filter out the hops until I just put this net, this fine mesh net on my bucket. And it goes all the way down in there pretty good. And just focus. Anyway, I sanitized it this morning. It's ready. And we're going to, when we pour the beer in, that's going to catch a lot of those little hop leaves. So it'll make it easier when we transfer later in a week from this to the carboy. There won't be as much stuff down on the bottom. It'll only be yeast and not yeast and hops, if that makes sense. So anyway, we're still waiting for things to cool down. Based on all the steam, I'm going to say it's still pretty hot. Another few minutes and we'll get there. Alright, I'll let you know. Let's see where we're at. So 99. Grab one of that. 99. Alright. I'm going to go a little bit more. See, now we've got 2 gallons of wort here. I have 3 gallons of cold water sitting in the fridge waiting to get mixed with this. So that'll bring the temperature down even more. We're shooting for a temperature like somewhere between 68 and 72. So you're shooting for 70 basically, and if you're a little low or a little high, you're okay. This yeast will actually work up to 75 or 77 degrees. So, all right, we are getting close. Okay, I got down to 85 degrees. I think we can cool it the rest with our cold water. And I'm just going to go that way though. Okay, I'm going to carefully pull this out. Okay, now I have to pick this up, so I'm going to set you down. Right there. Alright, so what I've done now is I've lifted up that bag. It's captured all the hops. There's a lot of liquid in there with it as well, so I'm going to let it sit here and drain a while. And while it's draining though, so nothing goes in there, I'm just going to set the lid on. And we'll give it a couple minutes to drain, and I'm going to go grab some cold water. See you in a minute. Alright, so it wasn't draining very fast, so when I came back after grabbing the water, I just started squeezing on it. And anyway, as you can see, there's nothing left in it now except hops, about that much hops. Alright, so my 5-gallon mark is right here. You can see I'm sitting at about 2 1/3. So that's the original 2 gallons of water plus all that malt and stuff that went in there. And you really do want to go just a tad over 5, because what's going to happen is all this sediment from the yeast eating everything, it's all going to drop to the bottom. We're going to have a pile of stuff there, and then later when we siphon it off, we'll lose some volume. So this will help make up for it. Alright. Wow. We're at 60 degrees. That thing worked too good. Alright, so I just went back and read my yeast. By the way, I'm using a wheat beer yeast just because it works well with higher temperatures. And it says here that it will work all the way down to 53.6 degrees. But ideally, it works best between 64.4 and 75.2. So the fact that it's sitting at 60 degrees, it'll, I don't know, in an hour or so, just sitting here while this yeast rehydrates, it'll get up to 65, and probably by the end of the day it'll be up to 72. I think I got the house set at right now. So I'll show you how I do it. Turn the top off my yeast, and you just sprinkle it on. You know, some recipes are all different. Different yeast work differently, and some you need to like aerate, which is mix up the wort really good and then mix the yeast into it. Some you don't. Pretty sure this one just said sprinkle on the top and we're good, and it'll wake it up and go to work. So now we put our lid on. Alright, so see how the handle is on the bucket? Make sure you put your hole on the opposite side of the handle, so that when you go to pick it up, you don't bang into the airlock here in a minute. Just a little tip. Alright. Pretty sure it's on there. Didn't make a good pop, but it's on there. Alright, now we take our airlock, set it down in there, and gently get it to seal real good. Alright, so we now have a closed off environment in there so that it can do what it needs to do, and only what it needs to do, and not get interrupted by wild yeast bacteria. So now you go find a quiet spot in your house. Oh, 5 gallons times Yeah, that's like 40, 45 pounds there. Anyway, sunlight's not a good thing. So I just shove it back here in the corner of the hallway. And that way when I'm walking in and out of the bedroom, I can glance at it and see if it's bubbling. And so this time tomorrow, midday tomorrow morning, who knows how quickly that yeast is going to activate. This thing will start bubbling. Bloop, bloop. And the more bubbles it bubbles, the more quickly it bloops, is how active it's going and how well it's working. I've had these things be done in a day, day and a half, and I've had others that take a whole week. So it's just a combination of which malt you use, which yeast you use, what your temperature is. There's so many factors involved. So anyway, that's the start of making beer, and I guess I'll show it to you trying to bubble up tomorrow, maybe, if it's bubbling yet. And other than that, we're just in the waiting game right now. Alright, so talk to you later. Okay, here we are. It has been 24 hours since we last looked at this thing, and as you can see, it is bubbling quite vigorously after 24 hours. So we are making beer, or well, the yeast is making beer. Fun times. Alright, we'll see what happens in a couple days. It'll probably start slowing down tomorrow and the next day. Okay, so it's been 4 or 5 days and all signs of activity have diminished. What you see me doing here is siphoning the beer out of the bucket, some call that the first stage, and into a glass carboy for the second stage. This is where the beer is going to rest and clarify and age a bit, usually about a week. This is what... here in a second you're going to see what the bucket looks like when it was all done. When it gets to the bottom, there's just a bunch of globs of yeast that dropped all the way to the bottom of the bucket. So that's why we don't siphon the bottom, we kind of siphon just above the bottom. That way all that sediment in there doesn't come down and end up in our beer. And you can see here it is a little cloudy. So what I'm thinking is at this point that wheat beer in itself tends to be very cloudy. The wheat yeast and the little bit of wheat that I put in this I think has caused it to be a little more cloudy than my normal beers. So after about 3 or 4 days, and here's those globs I was talking about, after 3 or 4 days of it not clearing up, I started doing some research and found that there's a gelatin that you can go buy. So I ran over to the beer supply store and bought this gelatin clarifying agent, and I added it to, I moved it out of that carboy back into the bucket, added the gelatin, put it in the fridge to cool it off because that gelatin works better that way, and then it cleared it up really nice, as you can see here. And now I'm taking it a couple days later out of the bucket and putting in my keg. Had an extra little step in there that I wasn't used to. I just wanted to show you about a week later, after it being on my my CO2 and getting a good charge in it, it now produces a nice head, and it's a very tasty beer, and every day it seems to get a little better. It smooths out, and anyway, I'm liking it a lot. It's a great summer beer, and just want to encourage you, get out there and try new things. If you ain't never made beer, get after it. I'll put the recipe in the description, and until next time, cheers.